Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, we're going to be discussing best practices for getting the most strength and size gains out of your triceps brachii muscle. Now, strengthening the triceps brachii is actually fairly simple. It really just involves elbow extension, but there's a lot of movement varieties that you have to choose from, and so we're going to go over those in this video. But before we get there, let's do a brief review of the anatomy of the triceps brachii, and understanding the anatomy and how they function more specifically will help us determine what ways we need to strengthen the triceps. So let's take a look at that right now. Now, the terms triceps brachii give us a really good understanding of what this muscle looks like and where it's to be found already. The brachium component refers to the fact that the muscle is located on the brachium, which is the proximal part of the arm, and more specifically on the posterior aspect of the brachium. Then the term triceps literally means three heads, and those three heads are as follows, and you can see them in the image right there on the right side of the screen. Those are the lateral head, the medial head, and the long head. Now, those first two, lateral and medial, those are what we call our one joint components. So they only cross the elbow joint. So their origin is some aspect of the humerus. We're not going to get too specific on that, but understand that they collectively merge into the triceps tendon, which then crosses the elbow joint and inserts directly on the olecranon process of the ulna, which is one of your forearm bones. And by pulling on the olecranon process, they facilitate elbow extension, and that is their action. That's their only action, okay? In contrast, the long head of the triceps is a two-joint component. So it's still distally is going to merge into the triceps tendon, cross the elbow joint, attach on the olecranon process where it will facilitate elbow extension. But if you look superiorly or proximally, you'll see that it actually crosses the glenohumeral joint and actually originates off of the scapula, more specifically the infraglenoid tubercle. So while the medial and lateral heads are not directly affected by shoulder position, the long head is. And the action that the long head has at the shoulder joint is shoulder extension. So if your arms are overhead like this, in any position of your body, as long as you're pulling down into extension against resistance, that is going to in part be facilitated by the long head of the triceps. So it turns out that two joint components of any muscle, they're most active when one joint is on a full or near full stretch. So if I want to get the long head most active, I need to put it on stretch. And so the way I do that is I take the shoulder and I put it at max or near maximum flexion. Now, that shoulder position isn't going to add any stretch to the medial or lateral heads, but it will add a big stretch to the long head. And so that means that to get most out of your long head of the triceps, you're going to be doing something that's going to look more like this, your overhead type of movements. And we'll get there towards the end of this video. Now, before we get into the specific strengthening exercises for the triceps, I want to dispel one big myth that's been circulating on social media and the internet for some time now. And it's been perpetuated by a lot of people, including higher ups in the fitness industry, like you can see right here. And these people really ought to know better because this is complete and utter nonsense, total BS. And that is that you can alter your forearm position, let's say between an underhand or supinated grip to neutral grip, which is a thumbs up grip, to overhand or pronated grip, and somehow that's going to alter which of the heads of the triceps is most contributing to the movement. This is totally false, okay? I go into a lot more detail on this in another video, but it suffices to say right now that when you're looking at movements of the forearm like this, which are technically of the radio-ulnar joints, the radius is the bone that moves. So if you have a muscle that inserts on the radius, changing the forearm position will have some effect on its function. Case in point, biceps brachii. However, any muscle that inserts on the ulna, which happens to be a fixed static bone in those movements, is not going to be affected by the forearm position. So when I go between these positions of the forearm, the ulna is not moving. And because the triceps insert on the ulna, forearm position makes absolutely no difference for the function of the triceps in relation to which head is most active, okay? Now there is an indirect effect, which I will cover in just a minute when we start looking at the first exercise, but understand there's no direct effect and no way you can alter the heads of the triceps and which one is most working by changing your forearm position, okay? Got that out of the way. So now take a look at this slide right here. So I have tricep strengthening exercises grouped into one of three categories, okay? The first category is where your arms are right by your side, okay? And you can probably think of a really good example right off the bat. That's going to be your standard cable tricep extensions. We'll get there in just a minute. Kind of a standalone exercise right there. Then group two is when the long head of the triceps is in a stretched position. So something where we've got the shoulders in some degree of flexion, okay? That's category number two. Category three is now where you have the arm behind the body, where it's in some degree of hyperextension. And there's a couple good examples that you can do right there. Okay, we'll cover those last. So your standard cable tricep extension on the surface might look really simple, and in fact they are really simple, but there are a couple important caveats I want to go over with respect to how you execute the movement. Number one is your stance posture. So you'll notice in the clip here that I'm in a slight hip hinge. I'm not standing fully erect at the hips. I got a little bend at the hips, which creates a little hip flexion pocket there in the front, okay? The reason I'm doing that is because if I stand up fully straight with this particular attachment, as I extend my elbows down, that attachment's going to crash into the front of my hips, and it's not going to allow me to achieve full elbow extension lockout. Okay? Now, while that's not the most important part of the movement necessarily, if you're looking to go full range of motion, you might need to stand with that little hip hinge, because then when you extend the elbows fully, that attachment's not going to run out of room to move. So you can get that full elbow extension lockout. Okay? If you're using a piece of equipment where it's not crashing in, or you just have an anatomy where it doesn't crash in, great. You don't have to stand with that hip flexed a little bit. But if you do run out of room and you're looking for a full lockout, get a little bit of a hip hinge there, okay? The second thing I'm doing is I'm keeping my brachiums fixed right by my side. I'm not doing this stuff where I let them come out in front and build up momentum that way. None of that. We're using strict form, arms right by the side, full stretch at the top of the triceps, extend all the way down, full range of motion, no rushing, no momentum, none of that, okay? The third thing is the hand position, technically the forearm position. So earlier I mentioned that forearm position has no direct effect on which heads of the triceps are working. It does, however, have an indirect effect in the sense that some grips are just better at strengthening the triceps than others. And it all has to do with wrist and elbow stability. So if you use a neutral grip, thumbs facing up, right? A good attachment for that would be a rope attachment. The muscles that are being used to stabilize at the wrist and the elbow are going to be your forearm flexors and probably your ulnar deviators a little bit. They don't really cross the elbow joint per se, but they are involved at the wrist. And those muscles collectively are pretty darn strong. If you're using an overhand grip, so some type of a bar attachment, okay, major muscles there are your forearm flexors. The common thing with those two grips is the forearm flexors, okay? That's a pretty strong muscle group at the forearm. When you choose an underhand grip, now when you extend down, it's requiring a lot more of the wrist extensors, not the flexors. And the wrist extensors are not nearly as strong of a muscle group, and that is true of anyone, even the strongest person alive. So when you use an underhand or supinated grip to do these elbow extensions, your limiting factor is going to become the wrist extensors, not the triceps. On any tricep strengthening exercise, we want the triceps to be the limiting factor, not the forearm or wrist muscles. So if you use an underhand grip, you're always going to be limited in how much you're actually going to be able to push using the triceps. So unless you've got some condition like golfer's elbow and really painful forearm flexors, there is never a reason to use an underhand grip. I want you to stop doing that altogether, not just for this standard extension right here, but for any other tricep exercise. There is never a good reason, assuming that you've got perfectly healthy arms, to use an underhand grip. Stop that right now. Choose either a neutral or an overhand grip, okay? So that is your standard cable tricep extensions. Now, one important thing here. Notice that the long head of the triceps is not on a big stretch. To put it on a big stretch, we'd have to be way up here, okay? So when we do a standard cable tricep extension with the arms by the sides, is the long head of the triceps working? Yes, because we're doing elbow extension, but that part of the muscle is not working as maximal as it could. So when we do it by the side in the neutral position, this is going to be much better for targeting medial and lateral heads, okay? Are we biasing one or the other? No, you really cannot do that, okay? But it collectively gets the medial and lateral heads there. If we want to start getting more out of the long head of the triceps, we need to switch to category 2, which is going to be your overhead tricep extension based movements, where now in this overhead position, we have the long head of the triceps on a stretch because we're in some degree of shoulder flexion. And the next best exercise to look at is going to be your overhead cable tricep extensions. Now, this exercise is phenomenal, and there's 2 really good reasons why. Number 1, we're going to be targeting the long head of the triceps a lot more. So if you're looking to get hypertrophy gains in the long head of the triceps, this is going to be a go-to exercise for you. We're putting the long head on a stretch, and yes, the long head does occupy a fairly good percent volume of the triceps, and overall the triceps are most of the volume of the brachium. Okay, it's not the biceps, it's the triceps. Okay, so really good for hypertrophy of the long head. The second reason is because we're also playing into the second function of the long head when we do an overhead tricep extension, and that is the shoulder extension component. That is not a function of the medial and lateral heads, but it is of the long head. So when you have it up in this position, not only is the force from the cable trying to bend your elbow into flexion, but it's also trying to pull your arms back into more flexion. So to counter that, of being pulled way up here, your long head is having to not only facilitate elbow extension to straighten the elbow, it's also having to facilitate shoulder extension to pull it out of this flexed position, or at least keep it from going into more flexion. So we're facilitating 2 functions of the long head of the triceps. And so for that reason, this exercise has been shown in some research articles to be superior to the standard cable extension where the arms are by the side. And not only is it superior for producing strength and hypertrophy gains in the long head of the triceps, but actually in the medial and lateral heads as well. The con of this exercise is that you have to have good, healthy shoulders and good, healthy elbows to be able to do this without pain. If you are somebody that has elbow issues when you start going overhead, you should, probably for the time being, stick to your standard tricep extensions. It's not a bad exercise. It's fantastic. In fact, Arnold Schwarzenegger said he got pretty much most of his tricep gains out of that exercise and not the overhead ones. So it is a good exercise. The other thing you should probably do is maybe continue to work on overhead movements, but take the load down significantly. It may just be that you're kind of overworking the triceps and you might feel some pain in and around the triceps tendon. So you might need to manage your load, take the weight down, and kind of just rehabituate the triceps tendon to load overhead if you have problems there. But if you don't have any of these issues, it is a phenomenal exercise. Now let's get to some more overhead tricep extension exercises. And I use the term overhead loosely because not all these are going to be overhead, but they are at the bare minimum going to involve the arm not by the side the whole time. They're going to come into some degree of stretch of that long head, maybe not a super significant stretch, but they more or less fall in this category versus the others. And you can see 3 of them right here, a little comparison. We've got the JM press, we've got the skull crusher, and we have a super range of motion skull crusher. So what is a JM press? A JM press basically is where you're on your back, let's say, either flat or a little bit of an incline, maybe 30 degrees at the most. You got a bar here, and instead of doing a standard bench press like this, you're going to lower the bar basically right towards your neck, like this. Not a guillotine press like this, but where your arms are more or less by your side. And then you come up, and then you come down. So a JM press is an accessory for the bench press. And the way it works is, when you're doing a bench press, at the bottom here, in the depth of the bench press, the pectoralis major, this is where it's strongest. Pec major is strongest in its lengthened position. As you go towards the top, at some point, the triceps start taking over as the prime mover because the triceps are strongest as they get towards their shortened position. So here, triceps are going to be the prime mover. Down at the bottom, it's more bench press, okay? The triceps are weakest in the depth back here. They're weakest here. So if you're somebody that's struggling to get out of the hole and you really want to maximize your ability to get out of the hole there, it might be beneficial to strengthen the triceps in that position. So you basically put the triceps on a pretty significant stretch here and then drive up. Now, granted, the long head of the triceps is not getting a significant stretch here, okay, by any means, compared to like your overhead cable extensions. But because the arms are coming out in front of the body like this, that's why I put it here in category 2. The next one is going to be the skull crusher. Now, with the JM press in this movement, you are getting some chest contribution. This is not a triceps isolation exercise at all. It gets a lot greater percent contribution for the triceps, but it doesn't isolate. To get closer to isolation, we do a skull crusher. So in a skull crusher, now the target becomes the forehead or the eyes or something in that vicinity. And you can see here that in this type of movement, there's very little shoulder movement. A properly done skull crusher with rigorous form, there should be zero shoulder movement, okay? All I should see is the elbow flex under control and then extend towards fully straight. That would be a properly done skull crusher. Now, one tip on equipment used for this. I find personally that if I use a straight bar, it's a little uncomfortable on the wrists. So to mitigate that, I would select either an easy bar or one of these types of bars that you can see here in this video clip where I can actually choose a neutral grip, okay? Something that makes it feel a lot more comfy on the elbows and the wrists. In any case, the skull crusher comes a lot closer to isolation of the triceps than the JM press. And I would make an argument that if you're just going after triceps from a get the triceps stronger, get them bigger point of view, skull crushers are superior to the JM press. If you're struggling to get out of the hole in a bench press, the JM press is the way to go. Now, if you want to make skull crushers worse, we do what's called a super range of motion skull crusher. And this one also starts to play into the same thing that the overhead cable extension did, where now we're getting a little bit of shoulder extension with the elbow extension. So really good for the long head of the triceps. And you can see that right here. So instead of going to the forehead or to the eyes, wherever my target was, now I'm letting the bar totally clear over my head. And so as I go down into the depth here, I'm going into maximum shoulder flexion, maximum elbow flexion. And as I come out of this, I'm having to facilitate elbow extension with shoulder extension. So now I'm really hitting up the long head of the triceps. And again, also good for medial and lateral heads, but really good for the long head of the triceps. I would make an argument that if your elbows, wrists, shoulders, all that can handle it, I would be doing the super range of motion skull crushers over standard ones any day of the week, okay? Much bigger bang for your buck there, in my opinion. Another overhead tricep extension, you can see right here, this is the French press, and no, I am not talking about the type to make my coffee here. But I would make an argument that the French press is not nearly as good as the super range of motion skull crusher or the overhead cable tricep extension. And that's because it's not really as concerned about the shoulder extension, it's only that elbow extension. So when you're up over here with a French press, again, you want to keep the shoulders at a constant angle, but we're really only getting good torque into that elbow flexion, and so our induced torque would have to be that elbow extension coming out. There's really not as much of the shoulder extension there that we're having to concern ourselves with. That being said, if you're just going after straight elbow extension, it can be a good exercise, but it's not my favorite. I prefer those other two. If you've got a ring set up or a TRX suspension system like I've got right here, another really good option is a body weight overhead tricep extension. Now you might look at that and say, well, it's got these straps that are moving around. There's some instability with that. You know, that's not as good for muscle building and all that good stuff, right? Not necessarily. Once you get all the laxity out of those straps and you're hanging from them and they're on full stretch, it's actually a lot more stable of an exercise than you would think. And I can tell you that Dr. Mike Israetel actually demonstrated a similar exercise with a barbell. You can do this with a Smith machine. It's a great exercise, but I actually like the TRX setup better, because the nice thing with TRX is, as you're going towards that full stretch, the strap moves with you and it kind of clears out of the way. And so it allows you to get maximum stretch into elbow flexion and shoulder flexion, so you can get the most out of your long head of the triceps. If you're using a bar for this that doesn't move, it can be a little hard to finagle that maximum stretch position, but boy, if you use the TRX, allow it to kind of clear out of the way and you get to that max position way up here, you can get a really big bang for your buck workout on the triceps with that. And the way you would progress it is either by stepping further backwards, so you're using a greater percent of your body weight, or eventually you can put your feet up on a stool or something like that, and so you're basically inching your body closer and closer to parallel to the floor, where you would get max tension on it. It's a very, very humbling exercise, but really good for the triceps, okay? So those exercises, while they still get medial and lateral heads, and they get them pretty good too, a little better for long head of the triceps compared to those in the neutral position. The final category of tricep strengthening exercises we'll talk about is strengthening where the arm is behind the body to some extent. The shoulder is in some degree of hyperextension. And there are two really good examples of this. One of them is a significantly better exercise than the other. We're going to finish with that one. So the one that is not so good, and I would argue that there's probably almost no one that needs to be doing it, is this one right here. This is the triceps kickback. This is one of those exercises probably everyone learned in high school weightlifting. There's a lot of fitness videos that you can order and do on your TV online, and some of them will have this one, and it is just not that good of a tricep exercise. The reason I'm covering it is, one, to mention that, but also to explain the reason why it's not very good. The one argument people would say that might make it a good exercise is that, oh, it really burns your triceps. Like, you don't need a lot of weight, and your triceps are on fire in that position back there. But there's a reason for that, and it doesn't make it a good exercise. The reason why your triceps burn so bad at the back position is because the long head, which is the part that you're probably feeling, is on active insufficiency, okay? This is the same phenomenon that you would feel when you're doing a seated heel raise and your gastrocnemius just feels like it's on fire, like it's about to cramp. It's the same reason why when some people do bridges and their knees are bent too much, their glutes aren't warmed up, they get a hamstring cramp. Your hamstrings are on active insufficiency. When you are back in this position, the long head of your triceps, which remember is most stretched up here, back here it's on active insufficiency, which basically means it's fighting like hell to contract, but it's not a very effective contraction, okay? So that burning you're feeling doesn't make it a good exercise. We can never confuse sensation with stimulus, okay? So that burning doesn't make it good. The major reason, though, it's not a good exercise is because the limiting factor is not your triceps. The limiting factor is the muscles holding you in shoulder hyperextension. You'll find as you do this exercise, you might be able to do some low weights, but at some point the weight gets so heavy that you're just not able to hold that shoulder up. Okay? Mechanically speaking, it is a very disadvantageous movement. And so if you're talking about progressive overload and the ability to do so easily being a criterion for good exercise selection, this one fails. Okay? It's very difficult to progressively overload past a certain point because the limiting factor is not the triceps, it's your shoulder extensors. Okay? So, generally speaking, no one should be doing this movement. It's not good. And just move on to something better, like a standard tricep extension there. Okay, that's a good one for beginners. Moving on to a significantly better exercise, and we'll finish with this one, and that is the dip. Okay, dips, Mike Metzner referred to as the upper body squat. This movement hits a lot of important muscles. It hits the chest, it hits the triceps, It hits some of the shoulder muscles as well. It's a really good stability exercise for the rotator cuff, and if you work up to full range of motion, it is not bad for your shoulders. Don't let anyone tell you that. If somebody has pain during a dip, it probably means that their shoulders are just not strong enough, particularly with either mobility or a stability issue coming from the rotator cuff muscles, to be able to handle the movement, okay? If you have all those prerequisites, though, it's a phenomenal movement and actually probably builds stronger shoulders than not doing them at all. Now, that being said, there are two ways to perform a dip. The first way I'll show you is a chest-centered dip. In a chest-centered dip, your posture is a little more leaned forward, okay? As you lean forward more and more, it starts to approximate a bench press or a push-up, right? So the more you lean forward, the more you're gonna hit chest. Now, obviously there's a limit to how far you can lean forward, but the point is you're leaned forward. In contrast, if we want to do a triceps-focused dip, one, we're not gonna be as hinged over posturally. We're gonna be a lot more vertically upright. Now, at pretty much every point in time during the dip's range of motion, other than lockout at the top, the arms are behind the body. And so pretty much you can say through the whole range of motion, the long head of the triceps is on active insufficiency. So as opposed to the overhead tricep movements, which are great for a long head, dips are not really that good for the long head. It still works, but it doesn't work near as hard, okay? So that being said, the greatest percent contribution to the elbow extension in a dip is going to be provided by the medial and lateral heads, okay? Very similar to the standard cable tricep extension, okay? The only difference is the cable tricep extension is an open kinetic chain exercise, and it does isolate the triceps. The dip is a closed kinetic chain exercise, but it does not isolate the triceps. So if you're looking just for an overall big bang for your buck exercise, the dip is going to be superior to the cable tricep extensions. But if you're just looking to specifically target the triceps, I would go with the cable tricep extensions. But in any case, hopefully this video gave you a really good understanding of how to best select your exercises for strengthening and getting hypertrophy gains in the triceps brachii. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.